Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Schaefer, and I'm Director of CHE, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. I'm zooming in today from Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, on traditional Mi'kmaq lands. I'm going to kick us off with a few bits of housekeeping before we dive into today's conversation. So this webinar is scheduled to last for an hour, and we're recording it for our webinar archive. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted except today's speakers. We invite you to introduce yourself and where you're zooming in from in the chat box if you'd like to. We'll have time for a brief Q&A session today toward the end of the hour. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the conversation, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We'll be closing the chat function once we get started so that we don't miss any questions that might get posted there instead. So now I'd like to welcome you to our first CHE Cafe. So to mark CHE's 20th year, we'll be having a series of these discussions with leaders in the fields of environmental health and justice. The idea is to get to know a bit more about some of the people doing this amazing work, their stories, motivations, and perspectives. I'll share more about upcoming events in the series at the end of the hour. We're also marking this 20th anniversary by doing some reflecting, stepping back and considering the best role for CHE going forward. Some of you may have participated in a survey or interviews this last spring as part of this process. And I have to say, it's been an exciting moment to step into leadership at CHE, and I look forward to sharing more about our new strategic directions later this fall. So for today's conversation, we'll start with brief self-introductions from each of our panelists, then some storytelling about their career journeys and connection to CHE, and then we'll wrap up with their reflections on how the environmental health and justice field is changing or has changed, and some thoughts on top priorities going forward. And then we'll have some time, as I said, for responses to your questions. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce today's panelists. We have Max Aung, Assistant Professor of Population and Public Health Studies at University of Southern California, and also Assistant Director of Agents of Change and Environmental Justice. Julia Varshavsky, Assistant Professor of Environmental Health at Northeastern University and former CHE Program Associate. And Steve Heilig, who's Associate Executive Director of the San Francisco Medical Society and Senior Research Associate at Commonweal, and also one of CHE's co-founders. So Max, let's start with you. What environmental health and justice work are you involved with today, and what's your connection with CHE?
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, and thanks so much for you and CHE for hosting this really great cafe series. The central theme of the research program that I've been working on and developing is really centered around integrating environmental health data science approaches to better understand the biological mechanisms that are linking environmental exposures to health outcomes across the life course. And so I've been focusing largely on industrial chemical pollutants that many folks might be familiar with in terms of consumer products, plastics, personal care products, and trying to understand their impact on adverse pregnancy outcomes and child development. And so most recently, my funded work has been addressing how different metabolic pathways are linking those chemicals to early measures of infant neurodevelopment to better understand potential neurotoxic mechanisms. And what I'm really excited about going forward in this, in this next couple of years is expanding on this work to focus on new outcomes such as mental health outcomes, particularly depression and anxiety, and really thinking about how these might be uniquely affecting marginalized communities such as immigrant communities, and thinking about different disparities in exposures as well as vulnerabilities in these particular outcomes.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for your amazing work. Julia, can you tell us about your current work and a little bit about your connection with CHE as well?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? So as Kristen said, I'm an assistant professor of environmental health at Northeastern University, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. I have a joint appointment in both the health sciences and the civil and environmental engineering departments. And I'm also core faculty in the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute that is directed by Phil Brown. And I consider myself an environmental health scientist and an environmental epidemiologist with a passion for doing science that has a real world impact. My core research agenda is somewhat similar to the way Max described his work on sort of the exposome, but I love the way that he described the connection with biological mechanisms. But the way I kind of think about it is I focus on mainly environmental chemical exposures in relation to maternal or parental and child health outcomes across the life course. And I have, or with the overarching goal of reducing harmful exposures in susceptible and highly exposed populations. I have had a particular interest in endocrine disrupting chemicals throughout my career and biomonitoring studies throughout my career. So that's been kind of my primary focus, but my other research interests also include advancing risk assessment and systematic review and thinking about how we use the science we have to make better decisions, community engaged research, and then also bridging the gap between health and sustainability. Before coming to Northeastern, I worked as a research scientist in epidemiology and biostatistics for the California Biomonitoring Program, which is housed within the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OWEHA, in the Cal EPA. And I also worked for CHE for a little over 5 years between my undergraduate and my graduate education as the program associate, and then eventually as the CHE-Fertility coordinator. And that was between around 2005 and 2010. And that experience really led me to pursue an MPH and a PhD in environmental health science. And I did that with Rachel Morello-Frosch at UC Berkeley. And then also did a postdoc with Tracy Woodruff at the Program on Reproductive Health in the Environment, or PRE, which is housed within the University of California, San Francisco. And both of those academic experiences really shaped my current research agenda, but I think also the diverse set of experiences across the nonprofit sector and the academic sector and working for a regulatory agency over the last 20 years has also really shaped my current work and perspectives or point of views on environmental health and environmental health research specifically. So.
Awesome. That's a really interesting path you've taken. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. Steve, how about you? You share a few words about the work that you're involved with now and a little bit about how you got there?
Well, good day, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. This is, it's sort of a culmination at 20 years of CHE, which is what we're celebrating and kind of launching this series of talks with. And it's kind of astounding, really, that it's 20 years already. But I have never had a full-time job before. I am a serial kind of co-founder and launcher of various organizations. But I did start out, as Julia did in some ways too, with first undergraduate work was environmental studies at one of the first environmental studies programs in the country at UC Santa Barbara, and then into epidemiology and public health. And since then, the number of issues, of course, is huge, but environmental health was a perfect combination of those. And I was already doing some work at Commonweal with Michael Lerner and others. We did things like Healthcare Without Harm, which is still a thriving organization spun off to clean up the impact of healthcare facilities and activities themselves. Keep Antibiotics Working, a effort to kind of help the looming threat of multi-resistant bacteria and other pathogens. which I saw these as environmental issues in a way. So I'm going to talk a little bit more after this, the next about CHE's origin and so forth, but this was to me somewhat of a natural progression. And so right now, well, and I'll say this too, it's just fascinating to listen to just the introductory presentations here, because Julia mentions the reproductive health program at UCSF that was midwifed out of CHE itself, and Julia herself being a former staffer here. Really great. And Max, one of the emerging leaders that been talking about and trying to help along too. Currently, not, other than CHE itself being kind of called back in to help along with this new era with our great new director, Kristen. I'm doing that, but working a lot now on actually reproductive health, reproductive rights issues, obviously, because we're now into this post-Roe era. And for 30 years, I've worked on trying to make access to the medical abortion, the abortion pills, easier and more in line with what the science shows about safety and efficacy. So we're back on that, working on that again, reluctantly, but we have to do it. And, this is an issue that I consider crucially important. And if you really want to put it out there in the broader context, it's also an environmental issue in terms of one of the most important things you can do to decrease unwanted population growth is to give women the right over their reproductive health. So that is kind of one of the highlighted issues right now. In line with my other I'm a clinical ethicist at local hospitals here. I teach in the medical school here, and we actually have in this both the medical center, UCSF, and the State Medical Association been working very hard, continuing on the climate issue. So that's the biggest one that has come up in the last 3 decades or so since I was in undergraduate, in environmental health, and way back then, climate wasn't an issue yet. So now it's the biggest one, overarching, as we sit here in the midst of the historic heat wave in the Western US. So anyway, 20 years on, it's very rewarding to see CHE still thriving and moving forward, and these great younger people who are going to carry it forward too. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. And I should mention, as Steve said, he's part of the advisory team for CHE. So I get the joy of working with him and tapping all those years of knowledge and experience and history with CHE as I get familiar and on board and step into the leadership. So thank you for that. And then I'm going to pass it back to you, Steve, as we shift to some storytelling to kick us off with that origin story of CHE, how CHE was founded.
Well, it's interesting. Like I say, 20 years, and I don't really think in those terms of anniversaries that much, but at some point I was taking a walk or something at the beginning of this year, and I realized, wow, we actually launched CHE in 2002. And as mentioned, that came out of connections at Commonweal with a number of people who were working on great projects. I'll mention particularly Michael Lerner, but also Dr. Ted Shetler, who had worked on healthcare without harm and other issues. Pete Myers, the pioneer in endocrine disruption, and others. So we had talked about what would be needs that a project that could actually move this field forward in some way. There were a lot of organizations and obviously a lot of researchers working in environmental health. But a primary need that we thought of was really better collaboration, as in the name, and cooperation among different disciplines. You've got scientists, very crucial to the whole thing. But then you've also got environmental groups that are more advocacy oriented. You've got medical and health professional, public health professionals. It's obviously should be part of their whole perspective. But our perspective was that a lot of these disciplines didn't work together that much, didn't talk together that much. So that was really a founding principle of what we were trying to push forward. And so Michael Lerner and I, taking some walks and talking about this, kind of sketched out both a consensus statement based partly on an essay he'd written, and also what the structure might be for a kind of very lean organization based at Commonweal, at least to start. We thought maybe we'd put it together for 5 years and then either if it didn't work out, let it go or spin it off. But here we are 20 years later because it has thrived. And in the very early years, you had a lot of people signing on to what was our consensus statement, which went through, I think 16 drafts and then was posted. And it was basically just an agreement. Here was something that we could all agree on and that we thought was important to guide our work. So within not long, we had thousands of people signed on to this. And we put on 2 large conferences at UCSF, co-chaired by one of the great leaders in public health and medicine, Dr. Phil Lee, who had been chancellor at UCSF and also an assistant secretary of health and a board chair at Commonweal at one point too. So it was immediate kind of credibility there from these connections. And those conferences, sold out. They were packed. And then we just took it on from there. We had a large conference at UCSF again that was kind of shepherded along by Allison Carlson, one of our CHE core group that wound up in the founding of PRI at UCSF, the launching of that, and a number of other early big successes that have lasted in that regard. So the bread and butter, though, in some ways has been seminars. I mean, this is a more casual one. We're calling it Cafe, but we started right away putting on webinars in a primitive sense 20 years ago in some ways, but it was really heartening to see how many of the leading figures in science and environmental health were eager to join in with us and talk, at these webinars for, an hour each time. So at the beginning, I was moderating most of those and directing CHE, and we have had a relatively small staff and a few directors through the years. Some may be on this call for all I know, but some of the staff I think were. And, that was based out at Commonweal in the beginning. You had to, in a sense. It was less of a virtual world than it is now. So it was very interesting to run an international collaborative out of this remote little willfully quirky and obscure town, out there on the coast, and really cool to see in that regard. So really, I kind of stepped back as in the more recent years, as we've, CHE has run along just great as it was. And so I'm thinking of this as kind of CHE 2.0 now because of how we have spent a bunch of time going through strategizing, and Blake, who I think is on this call, was a consultant who helped pull this together and shepherd it along, talking with a bunch of the founders and newer people about what we should do to remain the most useful in this modern realm of environmental health. So that's what we're basically launching into this with this call and others. And there will be a special section of the Medical Society Journal that I am a co-editor of that we have done, I think, 6 theme issues through the years, every few years, devoted to CHE's work and environmental health in general. And there will be that in the next one too that we'll make available to anybody who's interested online as well. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And appreciation to that core group of folks that, had the idea and followed through and made it happen. And one of the things that I've been really struck with as I've learned more about CHE's history is just how often the collaborative has played that kind of catalyst and incubator role of really bringing folks together and seeding ideas and launching. You mentioned a couple of them, and there'll be a couple that are highlighted in some of the articles that are in that compilation as well. And it's a really powerful and important role. So appreciation to the foresight of those founders.
Yeah, I should say, in that process that we've just been going through, one of the questions, we put it right out there and open, should we fold it if it's not useful? I mean, that's always a possibility. There's no point in just self-perpetuating, but nobody involved, and there's some pretty hard-minded thinkers involved on this. Nobody thought that was a good idea. And everybody thought, no, this has been a very useful project and organization. So let's keep it going and improve it where we can.
Great. All right, Julia, I'm going to toss it to you now for some storytelling about your path. Yeah.
So I'm going to start my story at the beginning of my life course. I grew up with a deep love and passion for biology, especially molecular and developmental biology. And I always thought I wanted to be a doctor growing up, which my parents, who were Russian Jewish immigrants, I was born right when they got to the US, really encouraged. You know, to them it was considered a safe and stable, successful and admirable job. But then in college, I became an environmentalist. I was really interested in waste issues, and I also developed a passion for social justice. And that's when I learned about what environmental health and environmental racism were. And I started thinking about how the environment impacts health versus the other way around. And I started thinking about prevention versus cure, you know, in terms of medicine. And then I also at that time became really fascinated from a biological standpoint with endocrine disruption. My favorite book in college was Our Stolen Future, which was the groundbreaking book or work on endocrine disrupting chemicals that was co-written by Pete Myers and Theo Colburn. And I decided at that time that I knew I wanted to work in the field. I just didn't know what role I wanted to play. I switched my major from the pre-med track at UC Berkeley to the which was molecular cellular biology, to a molecular environmental biology with a focus on human health and the environment. And and then also being the daughter of oppressed immigrants in another country gave me insight and passion for racial and environmental justice in this one. But I also wasn't really sure what role made sense for me as a white woman with a privileged background in this country. And I was also constantly torn, and kind of still am, about or between science and policy, or science and advocacy. So I kind of explored several roles in the field at that time. I worked for an advocacy organization called GAIA, the Global Anti-Incinerator Alliance, which then became the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives with Annie Leonard. I did my senior thesis on the bioremediation of dioxin using white rot fungi, highlighting incinerators as a key or primary source of dioxin emissions. I worked as a junior scientist in an ecotoxicology lab doing bench work with Daphnia magna to help develop a microarray to improve metal detection in water. And all of these different experiences that I was kind of bouncing between and trying to integrate in my mind ultimately led me to CHE, where I felt like I had finally struck the right balance for me at the time between sound, rigorous science and learning about the science and doing something around the science, and then translational work around the science. And so working for CHE, perhaps I think of, I guess, as my greatest career move, because it really gave me access to top scientific information on environmental contaminants and on endocrine disruption. And it gave me a real connection to so many scientists in the field. I was surrounded by some of my heroes like Pete Myers and Theo Colburn, Michael Lerner, Ted Shetler, Steve Heilig, who's on this call, as you know, Charlotte Brody, and then so many other cutting edge scientists and thought leaders in the field. And I was learning so much about the science and about effective communication of the science. And I really felt at that time like a sponge, soaking it all in and absorbing all of the information that I could. And at that time, CHE's mission, as Steve touched on, was really to foster scientific and public discourse or dialogue around environmental health research, and then to communicate and translate that research to key stakeholders. And the primary stakeholders were health professionals, health advocacy groups, and policymakers. And always with this core focus on rigorous science and civility. And it was kind of this safe space in some ways for diverse scientists and for non-scientists to talk about the science and the gaps in the research, the limitations of the work. And I felt like part of what we were doing at that time was highlighting and kind of validating environmental health research as mainstream science, and to bring that research to mainstream audiences. So, for example, we brought scientists from different disciplines together, like toxicologists and epidemiologists, to talk about and perhaps come to some agreement around non-monotonic dose response curves that you see with endocrine disruptors, which wasn't a traditionally accepted paradigm at that time. And so in a way, we were sort of validating this research, moving endocrine disruption forward in a real way. And then we would host, like Steve mentioned, these webinars monthly on different scientific topics, bringing those same diverse scientists together. So we'd have an epidemiologist, a toxicologist, and then we'd also have someone from the non-scientific community to talk about the research in plain language-ish, and then also to talk about the implications of the work and of the findings. And at that time, CHE was comprised of about 3,500 partners from around the world, with about 12, I think, working groups that were all organized around health outcomes. So we had, for example, the CHE Cancer Working Group, we had the CHE Learning and Developmental Disabilities Working Group, we had CHE-Fertility, and others. And I eventually became the CHE-Fertility coordinator, which was the core group, like Steve mentioned, that Allison Carlson had fiercely spearheaded and established with Linda Judice and others. And we worked collectively with key partners in the field, especially Tracy Woodruff, who became the director, to help launch and establish PRE at UCSF. And that was really the first major academic center of its kind with that focus in and so a lot of CHE's work, I guess, during that time was really, I think, as Kristen mentioned, to incubate and foster these kinds of projects that spun off and became their own thing. And I remember we talked a lot at CHE during that time about how our role was not to be at the front and center of something permanent, but rather to play this facilitator role behind the scenes to help develop something powerful and impactful that would live on beyond CHE's borders, so to speak. And, I remember Michael Lerner a lot saying that our role was to empower motivated and passionate people and help them get started and then get out of their way, which I really loved that role. And we also, at that time, grappled a lot with where the line was for CHE regarding science and policy. And, where did CHE's role end and another role begin? And at that time, we always landed on staying firmly on the science versus policy side. But what we did do is try to directly translate the science for our partners that were working on policy and advocacy. So one of the examples is in CHE-Fertility, we organized a consensus conference around with Tracy Woodruff and Lou Gillette, who's no longer with us, as key leaders of that meeting and co-chairs. And that was on women's reproductive health and the environment. What we know about the science, what we don't know, and where the data gaps are. And that ended up resulting in this published white paper by the scientists at that meeting and a lay translation report called Girl Disrupted. And we further translated findings from that paper and from the messages from the report into brochures and other non-technical materials that were distributed by and used by key health advocacy partners at policy briefings on the Hill, for example, to highlight the importance of national funding for women's environmental health research. And we also use those materials to do a lot of targeted outreach at the time to mainstream health professional societies like the Association of Reproductive Health Professionals, the Endocrine Society, ACOG, ASRM, etc. And that, for me, that was at the time when PRE had really taken off and was moving forward with all of those pieces, that I felt like it was I had really gotten a lay of the land on environmental reproductive health science. I knew I wanted to work on it. I kind of had a sense of who was doing what, where the data gaps were, and how I could potentially plug in. And that's when I decided to go back to graduate school and pursue more technical training to become one of these contributors on the science side, but always with an eye toward doing science that can actually facilitate progress. So I think I'll stop there and save other comments for the next section.
Great. Thank you, Julia, for sharing. I mean, that's a amazing, rich history, like right in the middle of CHE's, that period of CHE's development and being that catalytic force, and then having that sort of catalyze your own direction as well is really inspiring. So thanks for sharing that story. Max, I want to toss it to you to share what you'd like to about your journey in environmental health. You're muted.
Sorry, so funny how many times we do this. Yeah, so a little bit of background about me. I'm a first generation college student or college graduate. And I started my journey at UC Santa Cruz and really focused on also molecular biology as sort of my training, but I did a lot of research in ocean sciences and paleoceanography. So I was, working in a stable isotope laboratory and reconstructing past climate trends so that, future climate change models can be more accurate in terms of, how nutrients in the ocean and sea surface temperatures might be shifting over time. And that sort of blend of like environmental climate research with molecular biology has always sort of been, an interesting duality inside me. And I think as I finished college and I was like searching for different types of graduate programs to look into, it really made sense to pursue a graduate training in environmental health sciences because it just seemed like such a great convergence of, my past experiences in those, two areas. And I did my graduate training at the University of Michigan. I also did my postdoc training there. And I just wanted to say, throughout each stage of my career, from undergrad to graduate training, I have been really fortunate to be supported by strong pipeline programs that are geared towards underrepresented students, whether it's through funding opportunities, training opportunities, mentorship, all of those domains I've been really well supported through each stage of my career. One particular program I was in during my PhD was the Health Policy Research Scholars Fellowship, which is funded through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And it really focuses on enhancing our doctoral training so that we're learning health policy, didactic health policy tools and research translation alongside of our respective disciplines. And it's really funny. So through that program is actually where I met Dr. Aung. One of the summer institute trainings that I was at George Washington University, we were doing case competitions, particularly around climate change and health, like a new bill that had been proposed in the Senate. And so Ami was our group mentor for that case competition, and that's where I met her and got to know her better, and really just so much has transformed since then, because as some folks on the call might know, Ami is the director of the Agents of Change Fellowship. And ever since we interacted at that summer institute, she basically reached out to me and talked about this inspiring new idea about the Agents of Change Fellowship, about essentially providing, science translation and science communication training to underrepresented scholars in the fields of environmental health and adjacent fields that are contributing to environmental health research. And so I joined as the first cohort of the fellowship. And it was really exciting. I think, it was so great to learn from Ami. She's incredible. She's a leader in the field and just so knowledgeable. And to learn from her and also really contribute to shaping how this program would look like. And, from that program, I think it was back in 2020, it's how I formally got to be introduced with CHE. Because we're working with CHE to essentially highlight the program with a panel of us fellows. We were in this webinar series and talking about the different aspects of the program, the essays that we had written, about our lived experiences, about our journey through environmental health. And that was just a really great experience to partner with CHE. And since that experience, I've joined Doctors Yosita Ornelas Van Horn and Laura Edwards as assistant directors of the Agents of Change Fellowship. So it's totally full circle now, going through the program, being supported by these pipeline programs, and then being in leadership roles in these programs. I see it as such a great reward to sort of come back full circle. And, since we've joined the leadership, it's been really great because we've partnered again with CHE this past spring, I think in March and April. Both Yoshi and I, we hosted 2 separate webinars that were a little bit shifted in approach. We focus on themes this time. And so, I hosted one on toxics and health with Raya, and we essentially brought together senior fellows and talked about this really critical problem in environmental health and looked at it from different perspectives. So we had, the clinical perspective, the private sector perspective, and the academic, research perspective. And it was just so great to see how our partnership with CHE could evolve. And it was really great to be really creative in that space. And so, going forward now, I'm personally really excited to continue working with you, Kristen. I think there's a lot of great opportunities, and we have just, we've just selected our new cohort of fellows. So, stay tuned. We'll be announcing them very shortly, but they are going to be doing outstanding work. And I'm hopefully, we'll have a lot of opportunities to highlight some of their work, and think about ways to find opportunities for them to, collaborate with CHE and a lot of other types of, outlets, so that we can really get their work to a broader audience. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. And I should note that those 2 webinars that you mentioned were the first webinars that I was able to listen into as I was onboarding in the spring.
Oh, wow,
and
great.
They were really inspiring, just fascinating work that cohort members were doing. And yes, I remember you were facilitating one of those. So yeah, well, thanks for that story. So quick reminder, folks, if you do have questions, to drop them in the Q&A. And then we have one more question I'm going to have to ask folks to be pretty concise. It's a big question, so that might be hard. But we do want to have at least a few minutes to be able to respond to the questions as they come up. So this final question is just your reflections on what has changed, is changing, maybe should change, in the field of environmental health and justice, and what you feel like the top priority should be looking forward. And Julia, do you want to kick us off for this?
Sure. Yeah, it was so cool to hear Max's story and to hear more about agents of change and kind of your evolution to that, because I think that that has been something that has been lacking, over the last 20 years or before these kinds of programs have been implemented. And Dr. Aung was also a really important mentor for me in my transition from CHE to my graduate work, and she was sort of instrumental in helping me cut my teeth on my first studies that became my dissertation. And it's been a joy to see what she and now you guys are doing with agents of change in terms of filling the gap of or the need to help retain and recruit students and researchers of color in STEM and academic programs in general. And that's, I think, critical for one of the things I think we need to think about even more over the next 20 years, which is lifting up and promoting more community engaged research and community partnerships in research, but also, just in helping. So I guess I'll step back and just say one of the things I've noticed since I left CHE in 2010 and started my graduate school career or academic career, I guess, was that from then till now, the volume of studies has increased exponentially. It's exploded basically, which is awesome to see. And then we've really advanced our methods on how to assess chemicals and chemical classes like phthalates and PFAS as in groups, and so how to think about cumulative or aggregate exposure to these chemicals and the health impacts of chemical mixtures, etc. So we've sort of advanced our ability to analyze mixtures, and our statistical advancements have really been phenomenal, I think, over the last few years. But where I think we're still lacking, or where we need to go with that in the next 20 years, is how to better use that science in risk assessment, because risk assessment in the US is still chemical by chemical typically, and it still doesn't adequately include susceptible and highly exposed groups. So that's something I think that would be a really important thing moving forward. I also our ability to assess chemicals and non-chemical stressors as well has come a long way, I think, over the last 20 years. But that again is still, we still need to think about how to use that information to inform decision making that is actually protective of susceptible and vulnerable groups. So those are some of the things that I see. I know climate change has been brought up, and I have a real interest in bridging and working at the nexus of health and sustainability, which in my mind makes sense for me as by making the connection between toxics and climate change, and thinking about, for example, plastic production as a driver of climate change, but also as an important exposure issue in the population through things like consumer products, etc. And one of the other things, this is becoming more of a little laundry list, but one of the other things I would say is that we really need methods like systematic review methods to assess this big volume of studies and to kind of help us make decisions with the science that we do have. And I also think it's really important to think about and keep pushing for not just source reduction, but also green technologies, greener solutions for finding safer alternatives, and also pushing for technologies that are going to help us adapt and mitigate climate change effects, because that is sort of going to be the reality, I think, a lot of our work over the next 20 years is going to be around that issue. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I took too long.
No, that's a great list. Thank you for your insights. Max.
Yeah,
reflection?
that was a really comprehensive list. I agree with, all of those like those future directions that Julia highlighted. The topic of chemical mixtures is, I think, an evolving and like exponentially growing area, and trying to focus on this characterization of the whole exposome, right, rather than these single individual chemicals. I definitely see that as like a nonstop future direction of the field of environmental health. I also see, with as I've started, getting more involved with collaborations across the US, I've seen a lot more efforts put towards multi-cohort collaborations, and consortiums. For example, these children's cohorts through the NIH-funded ECHO program is an example. I think as these cohorts and and consortiums start to grow, there's definitely going to be stronger emphasis on team science, and I'm excited for what that means for the field of environmental health, because it will help facilitate breaking down silos and barriers in that regard. I'm also excited about how a lot more funding opportunity announcements are centered around health equity in environmental health and environmental justice. I think with more funding opportunities like that, it will really foster early stage investigators, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, to have the institutional support to pursue some of these really important environmental justice research questions, and really also have the institutional support to bring in and train underrepresented scholars like PhD students and postdoc fellows in these types of research areas. So, I think those are some of the main areas that I think the field is moving toward.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Steve, do you want to take us out with your reflections? Short and
There
sweet.
you go. I was doing. Hope you feel better, Max. I just did it too, muted. So it never goes away. So again, it's very rewarding to hear this. And so the things that I'd reflect on in terms of going forward is somewhat highlighted by this call, because here we have Max and Julia, the younger people coming up that have been involved. I was thinking back just about 5 years ago, not that long ago, we had a sort of an award series called 20 Under 40. So 20 environmental health pioneers under 40 were invited to, were chosen by, a panel of great people in the field and invited to do presentations on our webinar. So it's just an example of something that I think is a crucial role for CHE in terms of the future, to try to keep nurturing researchers going along and others in the field. Julia's a unique example here because she actually worked for CHE, but you've heard her here today, and that's why you can tell why we say she's one of our best products of CHE at this point, because it's just amazing to see how she's taken this forward and along. And I'm not just saying that, I mean, I believe that it's something else. So that's one thing. The future, the climate issue as a focus is just an obvious one. I mean, we both talked about that here, and I think everybody agrees that that has become paramount. And the science is exploding, not just on climate change itself, but on the impacts to human health in various ways. So that is crucial as well. And another one, going back to the very founding, when we were first talking a lot about CHE, if you were going to pick one element that was really central, it was environmental chemicals. It was chemical impact on human health. And obviously that's still a huge part of the work. But I think one of the things, and Julia alluded to this, the tension that we had from the very start between just facilitating the science, putting people in touch with each other, and actually being involved in policy and advocacy. And we did fall on the side of the former. In terms of policy, we were really just putting the information out there so people who were more focused on advocacy could take that it would be helpful to them. I'm thinking on one of the calls that I remember facilitating long ago, it's probably 15 years, we had all European scientists on talking about their chemical regulation proposal and policy called REACH, which was for the European Union. And it fell so strongly into the guiding principle of CHE that, prevention is better than cure. How do you change the default where chemicals are put out there and then you have to prove whether they are dangerous or not, instead of the other way around, like the FDA is supposed to do for new drugs and things like that. Say you've got to prove it's safe before you put it into your body, right? So that's an ideal that is still out there because we already have these tens of thousands of chemicals out there in the world and in our bodies. So I would like to see, just speaking for myself, more on how do we approach chemical policy in a way that moves it forward more than it is now. It's very important, and it's been a frustration of many people in terms of how do you really move that towards a preventive mode. It's hugely politically, financially, economically difficult for obvious reasons, but it's something that I think we need to continue to highlight when we can. So there's that. And the last thing I'll say, just because I'd feel remiss if I didn't, was that I think Max mentioned funders in environmental health. CHE has been a great beneficiary of funders as well, large and small, private foundations, et cetera. A lot of them are private enough, the foundations don't even want to be listed. So I'm not mentioning any names, but we need to just be very grateful to them too, because this was a kind of outlandish came out of Bellina's idea that some people, largely thanks in the beginning, at least to Michael Lerner's connections and credibility with them, agreed to take a chance on us. And some of them are still with us, and individuals as well. So putting the work out there that appears and is substantial, and if you can focus on these things that I've mentioned, that we've all mentioned, climate obviously is important, but bringing forward and helping younger people into the field, I mean, that's just undeniably a worthwhile thing to do. So, we should be grateful to our funders, whoever they are, large or small, and hope they will stay with us and keep going forward. So, and I especially, both Max and Julie, thank you so much for doing this. It's just, for me, it's just it's a great thing to see and to listen to.
Same here. That was really fun. Really nice.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you both and all of you. We have a couple questions. I think we have time to do a quick check-in on the questions, and then we have a few minutes for wrap up at the end. I'm gonna put you all on gallery and so that folks can see all of you, and stop my video so that I don't have to be in the gallery. So they're very different questions, actually. So this first one, we might not be able to answer in 2 minutes, but I'm going to put it out there for you guys. Is there potential, this is from Ralph Pentland, is there potential for bringing DNA, RNA positive gene editing science together with accidental gene editing via chemical pollution? Does anyone have some thoughts on that question?
Kind of outside of my area.
Yeah,
personally, yeah.
Although, you can say that, when you read about this from whatever perspective, I mean, even reading like a recent long New Yorker piece about it, I mean, that's technology that, at least in theory so far, can have an impact everywhere. So, you could say at this point, maybe, probably, if it carries forward, and then, as it professional ethicist, I have to put the caveat in there. You got to be very careful when you mess with those fundamental building blocks, et cetera, because there are often a lot of unpredicted consequences.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
And I
Julia?
would say that's especially true with if you're bringing in chemical pollution into the mix. It seems like that in and of itself would be messy to look at, but
Yeah.
but also I don't know, I guess, enough about positive gene editing science to answer more fully.
Okay.
Well, there's your
So-
next project.
So our second question is from Rose in Kenya. She says that I've been following CHE closely. It's really wonderful. We don't have this here in Kenya. I wish also to join you and learn more. How can I enroll in your classes? And I'll start off by letting you know, Rose, that the webinars are all free. So you can register, and even though the time zone might make it difficult, there's always a recording that you'll get. And so you can go back and listen to the webinars after the presentations. So, and thank you for zooming in and following CHE's work from Kenya. Anybody have anything to add for Rose?
I would just reiterate that if you have an internet connection, it's not difficult to find the information. It's all on the website, recordings of everything. So I just kind of reiterating what you said, Kristen.
Yeah, we might also mention that part of this new launch is a redoing and updating of the website too.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to mention, is that we're going to be revamping the website a little bit, and one of the goals is making it more searchable than it already is. It already is searchable, but making it even more user-friendly that way. So hopefully that'll make it easy to access all the materials that are there. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to shift into wrap-up mode. Just have a couple of announcements. First, just want to say thanks to everyone. And I want to let everyone know that there'll be a video recording, as I mentioned. It'll be on CHE's website very soon. And tomorrow, all the participants will receive an email containing a link to the video. The next CHE Cafe will be a conversation with our CHE Alaska partners. I'm really excited about this one as well. That'll be Tuesday, September 20th. And I will drop the link for that into the chat. There you go. And then we also have an EDC Strategies Partnership call coming up next Wednesday, September 14th, and that's going to focus on the latest science on exposure to PFAS and markers of liver injury. So there's the link to that one. You can also find these on the CHE website, healthandenvironment.org. And then stay tuned for information about other cafes coming up. We have them scheduled out in October and in December. We have some really great conversations planned. We'll also be celebrating with a hybrid in-person online event at Commonweal on Saturday, November 12th. So I encourage you to save the date, even if you're not in the Bay Area, you'd be able to zoom in and look for more information on that coming out very soon. If you're new to CHE and you'd like to stay updated about upcoming events, please sign up to receive our newsletters. You can select the Join Us tab at the top of any page on the website. And if you're inspired to make a donation to support CHE's ongoing work, you'll find a donate button at the top of the website as well. And as Steve mentioned, we're forever grateful for folks who have been supporting this work over the many years. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their work promoting environmental health and justice, and for taking the time to be part of our conversation today. And appreciation also to all of you who joined us today for the first CHE Cafe. Thank you.